Thank you, Tyler. I was just telling Tyler a few minutes ago that we sprung 5 surprise panelists on him because we wanted to get this into the program, but we're doing it at a time where everybody's travel plans were in flux and we weren't exactly sure who we were going to have on the panel, and then we were able to make it virtual. So we're very pleased to have 3 members of the National Case Writing Committee and 3 members of the Regional Case Writing Committee with us. So from the National Case Writing Committee, we've got Cynthia Jones here, and we have Robert Skipper here, and Heather Pease here on her iPhone. And then from the Regional Case Writing Committee, we have Michael Funke and Rhea Funke, or Rhea Dodds Funke, and Raquel Diaz-Sprague, I thought was going to be able to make it, but I don't actually think she was able to make it. So it'll just be all of us. We're glad to have the actual case writers, part of the case writing panel. If there's some time, Richard and I will talk a little bit about some of the question writing that goes on, because that's sort of a separate or a secondary process after the case writers send their cases, and that process is a little different, regional and national. So what I thought I'd do is just try to have, I've got a few questions that I was going to ask the panelists. We'll try to keep that to about a half hour or so total, so that we've got lots of time for questions from the rest of folks. And if there aren't questions from the rest of folks, I will come up with other questions. And the main thing I wanted to do is sort of start super basic, and I'll start chronological in terms of when the cases appear. So I'll start with the regional case writers first. And I'm going to ask the same question to the national, but if you could just walk us through in a minute or two, just the basic process that you all go through when you're trying to think of the cases that might be good cases for the year, and how you sort of go from initial ideas to what we see in just after Labor Day.
I'm going to defer to Michael.
Michael's the chair of the regional committee, so thanks.
Yeah. So the process starts in a couple weeks here. I'll send out an email to everybody on the committee saying, hey, let's collate ideas, and we'll get a list of usually 50 or so topics. Everybody has their own process for how they come up with their topics, but everybody on the committee sends in topics. Sometimes we get topics from members of APPE or Ethics Bowl participants, and we always put those on the list. I save every time I see something ethically interesting, email it to myself at Ethics Bowl. So we put that list together, and then the group votes on the list, and we try to produce a top 15 list that includes everybody's at least top choice and any choice that got 2 or 3 votes. Some years there's more agreement about which cases should be the top choices than others, but we rank choices based on the number of people who vote for them and how high in their list they vote for them, and then produce the list of cases that we're going to write. Usually whoever has either submitted the topic or voted it in their top 5 writes that case. And so we've got a group usually of 5. All 5 people will write 3 cases. And then the writing period is individually drafted. So one person will draft each of the 15 cases, or 3 of the 15 cases. And then we have an editing process that is to take your case. So John, if you were to write 3 cases this year, you might, once you finish writing those cases sometime early summer, you would send them to the next case writer in the line, who would read it and make comments, both substantive and formal. It's kind of editing process. And then that case writer would pass it on to the next case writer in the line, who would do the exact same thing to those cases. So we'd get 2 rounds of editing. And then the case would go back to you with the comments and suggestions from 2 other case writers. And then you would redraft it, taking into consideration those comments. And then once it was done and what you wanted it to be, I would get it. I just kind of put them all together and send them off to you.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. So it's really, the timeline is spring to late summer is when all this is happening. Okay, great. And then, Rhea, were you saying something? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's one little bit. Additionally, once we've done the sort of scoring of like which cases are chosen, there is a brief review. If there's a question, we do try to favor a broad variety of topics. So if we can get some journalistic ethics, some medical ethics, you know, animal ethics, just a variety of topics. If there's ever a question, we do try to favor lack of repetition, and particularly if two cases are very similar, we will pick one of them that got the higher score and then scrap the other one if they both got a lot of votes. So
Yeah,
there is a little bit of editorial work involved in the choices.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was actually going to be my second go around, is sort of, this is great, because I wanted to talk through the formal process, especially because I think some of the people that might be either watching this now or watching a recording of it might be interested to know, how can I get involved in the writing process, whether it's submitting ideas to being on the case writing committee, et cetera. But then also, I think there's a lot of coaches and judges who are just like, you know, oh, why, you know, it's interesting to see that, oh, it looks like they're really into free speech this year or whatever. They're just sort of curious about sort of the theme. So Richard had his hand up, and then I'm going to turn it to Skipper here to get a sense of the process for the national group.
Yeah, so just a quick question. You guys have references in yours and the national group doesn't. And the number of references seem to be growing over the years, which is great. And I'm wearing my coach hat now. My students greatly appreciate it. Do you put those in as you go? Is it the case writer will just put in whatever references they want, or do you have some sort of review process after the case is written where you add
There's a little bit
links
of
and
both.
citations?
There's a little bit of both. Several of the committee members are attorneys, and they are just kind of citing nuts. And so we pare back some of the citations for a few of the case writers. They tend to go a little overboard, and it would make the cases twice as long as they need to be. And some of the case writers, you get the occasional link or suggestion that the article is in this place. And then we do some filling in of what the citations or links were after the fact. So I'd say there's like some on both ends, but I guess we decided some time ago that it was nice to have background information and to know where this stuff came from, so that it's not just out of the ether. Occasionally we'll do a fictional case, but those are pretty uncommon. We just want to be as transparent as possible about where the information is coming from.
Well, you've given us a perfect segue to go over the national team, because that's one of the differences between the regional and the national, right? Is that intentionally there aren't references in the national cases. So Skipper, can you talk us through your process?
Okay, well, there's an ideal process and there's what really happens. So I'll give you the ideal process, because this is kind of a sales pitch, right? To get more people to join the case writing group. I set up a spreadsheet on Google Sheets, and all the case writers over the period of several months will contribute case ideas. And on the spreadsheet, we list whose idea it was, and who submitted the idea. Those may be different. That is, who submitted the idea to the case writing group, and it came from a student or it came from a colleague or whatever. And then we have a column for approvals. So everybody on the case writing team has to sign off on saying this is an okay case. There's a column for links. So if a case needs to be backed up by some sort of news story or whatever, there's a link to that. And then a brief description of what the main idea is. So this list accumulates over several months. And then we get, from Michael, we get a list of the case ideas that the regionals are actually going to be doing, so that we can strike out anything on our list. And so after all of these are gathered, usually maybe around 50 or so, then we all get together physically in one spot and shut the doors and don't let anybody out until everything's done. And that's an interesting process that probably deserves its own panel session. But over a period of 5 days, we will approve which cases are going to be done. We will write them on Google Docs. And so everybody at their convenience will make comments on the cases as they appear. And by the end of the process, the cases are all done and the comments are all addressed. And because we're in the same physical location, we can harangue each other about issues that don't necessarily appear on the comments. It's a really intense week. And I think I've been very happy with the results. During the pandemic, everything got all messed up. So we tried to do the same process virtually, and it's hard, but we still do all the writing in a 1 week period.
I hear there's sometimes wine involved too. Is that right?
Is this being recorded?
Sorry.
Well, Skipper, never mind an additional session for in person. We're gonna set it up like a reality TV show in the future.
Oh, okay.
But we'll put cameras in there. Yeah.
Just give us a venue like the one we had last year. That was great. The Prindle Institute was great.
Oh, great. So that's also over the summer. Is that right? The meeting time?
We prefer to do it at the beginning of summer, but this last year we did it at the end of summer. But the beginning of summer is generally the only time that everybody is able to break free.
Gotcha. Okay. So to go back to the question that Rhea brought up, or the issue Rhea brought up in terms of getting variety in terms of types of themes that show up in the cases, things like that. I'm curious. So I guess I'm sort of playing role of audience member here too, but do either of the committees, in addition to, it's interesting to hear that you talk to each other, which makes sense. Do you look at like a set of previous years when you are writing cases, or do you sort of just, it's really about diversity within that year?
We do look at previous years, but most of the time that takes the form of our memory, institutional memory. But most of us, I mean, several of us have been on the committee for many years, and so we're familiar with what's happened in recent time.
Gotcha. Cynthia, you had your hand up.
Cynthia.
I was going to say that, sorry, I was going to say that we actually look back and make sure, it's okay to have another case in a similar vein, but we try and make sure it's at least not in the last 4 years or so. So no student theoretically who competed. Yeah, that's where I was going with that. So
we've had cases in which the technology has changed dramatically from the first time it was written. And so that will sometimes warrant a revisiting of the same issue with new technologies.
Okay. Rhea, you had your actual hand up there for a second.
I was just going to say that we actually wait about 5 years because we know how, I know how long I took to graduate. So we gave it 5 years.
Well, we try very hard not to ever replicate a previous case, but that gets harder and harder as the years go by.
Sure. Heather, yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the things that we also look at is trying to ensure that the ethical or moral dilemma that's being present isn't being repeated. So you mentioned using free speech earlier, and we've had several cases on free speech, but the core ethical problem of that free speech is pretty significantly different between the cases and the cases. So it's not just the topic that we're looking at when we don't want redundancy. It's more of how has this dilemma changed and grown over the years, and is the dilemma the same that we had previously written about?
Okay. So this question's sort of for everybody, I suppose. And Richard, this may be a segue here in a minute for you and I to talk a little bit about the questions. I'm just sort of curious if, when you all are writing the cases, when you look at the finished product, do you ever sort of say, yes, or do you say, yes, these are all equally complex? Or do you ever sort of step back and say, well, case number 13 is a little less complex than case number 9? And how much of this idea of balance goes into the process when you're looking at the sort of total package when you're done with the cases? Rhea, you brought this up in terms of thematic balance, but I was just wondering other ways that you think about trying to balance considerations.
I do try to have a variety. And, one of the things, the only thing in terms of difficulty or some of the less clear cases we put near the end of the packet, and that's some regions only do 12 cases. They remove the extras. So I was asked to put some of the weaker cases at the very end, or ones that I thought involved less interesting discussion. But in terms of difficulty, I think it just naturally evolves that way, that some issues are going to be just bald-faced, this is the question, and other ones are going to have complexity. And we simply look for good questions that haven't been dealt with before and a variety of topics. And so, at least when I make submissions, that's what I do, is I get as many different topics as I can, and I try to cover as many different areas of ethical concern, because practical ethics is a broad swath, and we want to catch medical, we want to catch business, we want to catch everything, so that people of any venue feel like they're involved.
Michael, if your cases are always 13, 14, 15, now you've got to talk to Rhea about how she feels about them. Yeah.
Well, in part, we can only control how challenging a moral question will be so much. What we're trying to do, I think, mostly is keep the facts of the case from getting in people's way and doing the analysis. Sometimes the analysis is just going to be harder because there's stronger competing forces or more of them.
Kipper, you were trying to say something, and then Richard had his hand up too.
I think a lot of that discussion takes place before we even start. Because there's a fairly lengthy process of discussing why this case should be included, and what are its merits and what's the other side, and by the time that's all settled, then the complexity of the cases are pretty clear. Cynthia.
Thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead, Cynthia, and then Richard's.
Yeah, I think that we are good checks on one another. So I always have a soapbox. And Skipper says no to most of them, because he'll be like, that's not gray enough. You're too biased. And so what Skipper is amazing at, and he has been since the very beginning, is truly being the objective, right? And making sure that the cases are uniquely gray. I might think there's a right answer. Skipper might think there's a different right answer, but that's not the point. They really need to be not obvious. And I'd say about half the cases I throw at Skipper, he's like, I don't see the dilemma. That seems simple. And I think that's really important to note. And that when we talk to students about it, because I coached for 10 years before I really started case writing, I will also throw this in. Sometimes the students add the complexity that we hadn't seen, or take it in a way and turn it into. So I'll throw an example out there. This Title IX case last year that I wrote, that I threw in the phrase due process. I didn't expect that the students turned it, and I didn't think it's wrong of them to end up in a legal discussion about that. That wasn't what I intended. So I am constantly amazed and impressed by how students take an issue. Sometimes I think that's very simple, and then make it really interesting and complex, just to throw that out there.
Great, thanks. Let me get Richard. I'll come back to you, Rhea. I'm sorry. Richard's been waiting, and I know Taz is waiting too. And then I want to actually follow up on that legal point that you just mentioned in a second. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah. So one comment. I wasn't aware that the regional group was putting the weaker ones at the end. So our region's one of the ones that drops, and we always have a vote on which ones to drop, and it's almost never from the last three. It's usually earlier ones. And so the comment is, I suspect that if cases seem really good, some of the coaches will go, oh, that's going to be tough, and they actually want to do that. But I wanted to ask a question. So but, you know, my wife and I host these public events called Ethics Slams. And you know, we pick controversial issues, and they're sort of very ethics bowl-esque. And we had one scheduled on the Me Too movement, just coincidentally the day that Kavanaugh was about to be confirmed. And we ended up getting a 1-week reprieve on Kavanaugh because the Senate subcommittee decided to look at it for another week. But it was clear it was going to be a disaster, right? Because if we want these to be like ethics bowl competitions where they're respectful and friendly. So at that particular moment in time, we were quite relieved not to be talking about an issue quite that hot. For both committees, do you have cases where you just, you know, maybe I'll make one more point. We've had a couple cases in the past that raise issues for the trans community. And many members of the trans community are not comfortable with cis people talking about their issues, no matter what side of the issue they're on. And so we got a lot of blowback. But do you guys ever think this topic is too controversial, too hot? And Ria's got a hand up, so.
Absolutely. That was actually Denny, my mentor, but way back when, told me avoid things like, especially abortion is a really tough subject because people are very emotional about it. And she said, try to pick more nuanced issues that aren't just everybody's already debated them, they're old news, but particularly things where there's a danger that judging will become unfair. And so if we feel like the judges are not going to be capable of divorcing their personal emotional reaction to something from how they judge a team, that is something that we avoid. But there's something really important that we haven't even touched on yet. There are case writing criteria that were developed back in, I believe, like 2006 or 2007, somewhere way back when. And I can list these out because I don't know if everybody listening here has heard them. So it's important that maybe we share what those case writing criteria are. And I can share this list. It's written out if anyone wants to read the details, but I'll just read the headlines, which are, we look for cases that demonstrate a conflict that is widely troubling, meaning that it affects a broad number of people. We try not to talk about Joe down the street. We try to talk about something that at least has a population of people that are going to be affected. We try to find cases that demonstrate concerns about which reasonable people can disagree. And that goes right to your issue. It's a rule. Reasonable people must be able to disagree about our cases. If reasonable people cannot disagree, it is not a good case. Cases demonstrate collectively a broad arena of venues in which moral issues arise, which is the business ethics, medical ethics, journalistic ethics, a wide array so that not just everything is medical ethics this year. Cases demonstrate collectively international scope. That's actually more for the national team was supposed to focus a little bit more internationally, but we tend to be a little bit more, because we're regional, smaller in scope. But that was one of the things we discussed when regionals started. Also, cases demonstrate collectively appeals to a variety of moral concepts. That is, while some cases appeal to consequences, not all do. Others appeal to professional integrity or human rights or whatever, but they encourage kids to take different views based upon sort of the predominant notion on certain things, and maybe encourage them to try different thoughts. Cases demonstrate collectively a variety of relationships. So for instance, friendship, personal, professional obligations, things like that. Cases demonstrate sufficiently complex conflicts that more than one type of question may be asked, or more than one ethically relevant feature can be addressed. For instance, students can reflect on structures or systems that generate moral dilemmas or encourage, tolerate wrongdoing. I'm getting close to finished. I think there are 11 here, so sorry, pardon me. Case descriptions should be sufficiently thick that it is that the context is clear. So meaning that we don't just lay out the dilemma, but we give them something to sort of wade through. However, cases collectively demonstrate various levels of complexity, which we talked about already. Case details must be accessible to a broadly educated person. So we can't make something where they can't do research and can't figure out the answer. And cases cannot be resolved merely on empirical grounds. Those are the criteria. So if the cases fail to meet those criteria, then they're probably not going to be chosen for a particular year.
Thank you very much there, Rhea. I had forgotten about that list, and we might actually entertain putting that somewhere public so that coaches and such can get a sense of those guiding principles. That's really helpful. Taz was patiently waiting with the hand up for a while, and it's exactly a perfect pivot. I have other questions, but we're at the half-hour mark, so we'll try to get some questions from the audience here. So Taz, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, actually great timing, because Richard kind of touched a little bit on what I was going to ask, and I think I might have gotten my question answered. But I did see, I've been a veteran for some time as a participant, and then I've come back as a moderator. I've seen a couple of teams being coached. And I did notice over the last few years that there's been more of a focus on local issues, more US based, a few less cases that deal with international dilemmas and, cases from abroad. So I wanted to see if there was a particular reason why we were probably navigating, or if there was a reason why we felt it was more relevant to have cases that dealt with issues in the US, fewer cases outside of the US. So it was kind of more dealing with one of the points I guess you touched with, but is there maybe on the horizon, a movement or just maybe in desire to involve more international cases or cases that deal with stuff outside the US?
Skipper.
At the national level, no, that's just the way it turns out. We don't have an intentional direction to go.
The regionals, we try to have, so when I'm working on cases and topics, part of what I think about is I try to think about pairings. Not that I have anything to do with what the pairings look like. I just, when I'm thinking ethics bowl, I think about pairings of cases. And so we always try to have two cases that have some international dimension. But of course, like we're all, I guess not of course, but we are all based in the United States. And so we probably have a US bias in terms of the news we read and the things we have background information about. I think most of our students also are probably going to have an easier time processing things where they don't have to learn a ton of background information. Same is true for the case writers, but we do try to include a couple of cases a year that have an international dimension. Sometimes it's stronger than others.
And it's, I'll get Cynthia 1 second. It's actually, one reason I'm glad we're doing this panel is I'm assuming it's good to just hear comments like this, so that, because sometimes I think, you might not even be conscious, like, oh, I didn't realize we were drifting this way or that way. And so to have people say that, that's good for us all to hear. So yeah, Cynthia. And then I wanted to pivot off what Michael just said to talk a little bit about the pairing of cases and the question writing. I'm going to turn to Richard for that. Cynthia?
Sure, and that's an excellent question from Taz, but I want to couple it with something that Richard said, which is about representation, right? So I am a cisgendered white woman. I'm definitely queer, but I'm not trans. And I think I would be, but we have this issue, right? We, and shout out to our trans sisters and brothers and the struggles that they face. And I can't appreciate the struggles they face because I'm not that. And I can't appreciate the struggles that my Mexican-American wife faces because I'm not that either. And it gets real challenging too. I mean, we certainly do not want to be disrespectful. We want to be inclusive. I think it's the same with the international issue, as they've hinted at. We're all US based. Give us more case ideas for other places. Some things I think are transcendent in the sense that there are some issues, moral issues that they might play out a little bit differently in a different context. But some of them, I think, are a little bit more overarching, and that's what we try and get at sometimes in the case writing. So thank you for those comments. So I think they're both on point. I mean, how do you write about things when you don't have that identity? So thanks for that.
And one thing, Rhea, I'm sorry, I keep putting you on. I will come back, I promise. One thing that we're going to talk with the case writing groups about going forward is how to make sure that we're getting representation in the case writing groups as we go forward, and trying to, the alumni network was started last year officially, and trying to leverage some of that into opportunities for people to get involved in the process at various steps along the way. So Skipper, Mike, I'll follow up directly with the two of you to sit down and sort of brainstorm some of that stuff. Rhea, can I get to Richard, or do you want to say something quick about this previous thing?
Well, very quickly, we are always accepting volunteers. So that's one. Both committees are very happy to have volunteers. And secondly, I don't think we're going to be doing a lot of like, should trans people be involved with things? I think we did that many, many years ago without full awareness of how hurtful that could be. So we won't be doing that anytime soon again, unless it's like, should we, like, I don't know, exclude cis people or something, maybe that, but not the other way around. But no more, it's potentially punching down, and we never want to do that.
Well,
Yeah,
I think, go ahead, Richard.
Oh, just at the time, it kind of, in retrospect, felt a lot like, what part of the bus should people of color be allowed to sit? I mean, it just, it felt really tone deaf on behalf of, our community. So I appreciate the stance that you're taking, Rhea.
Yeah, but I remember, Richard, we had talked about this issue back then, and what's hard, I think, is that it may be that everybody at an ethics bowl or in the ethics bowl community believes there really isn't two different sides by the time the case comes out, right? There's been almost a 6 months, sometimes 9 months, there's been a lag in time. We might say, well, really, people can't reasonably disagree. Yet it's being debated in legislatures. So there is, in fact, a debate among people about it. So that gets tricky. Justin, I'm going to come to you in a minute because I want to turn to the issue of case pairing and questions here, because people might not be aware of that process. And I want to ask Richard about this. He and I often do this together, but the process has changed over the years a little bit. The process for the regional is a little different than the national. So Richard, can you just talk us through exactly why case 2 shows up with case 7 and why the questions are what they are, sort of how that happens?
Yeah, sure. So, it used to be the case many years ago, maybe, a decade or so, that we would get together and initially pair the cases and then write the questions. And so we would pair them thematically, to the extent that that was possible, with a secondary consideration being given to something like level of complexity or the demand that the case puts on the students. It wasn't very long where savvy teams would be able to guess which case was coming second, right? So if you were team 2, you didn't necessarily have an advantage as you're thinking about your case, while team 1's doing their thing, maybe responding to judges, but you might have an advantage, right? So if there were 2 environmental cases, it was a good bet that they would both show up. And so, there were a handful of complaints or concerns from coaches and whatnot, saying this just isn't fair. If we win the coin toss, we have an advantage. If we lose it, we don't. So we went to a random pairing by rule, right? The rules committee debated this at great length. And so we now just, go in advance and set them up randomly. So round 1 will have these 2 cases, round 2 and so forth. Whatever's left over will be the emergency round. And that's where we start, right? And then we write questions independent of the pairing for each case. One question that we take to be an elimination round question, which is more straightforward. One question which we take to be, preliminary round, easier, and then elimination round, maybe a more demanding question, right? Something that asks the students to go a little outside of the box from their preparations. Then once we've done that, we get together and we tweak all the questions as a committee or an informal committee, a small group. For years, it was John, Pat, and I. And then John and I, and then we brought Jordan in when Pat passed away. And then this year I'm coaching, so I don't know who's doing it. By the way, the questions should be a lot better this year since I'm not involved in that process. I'm always the impediment to the really good question.
Not at all. Just so people know why it's Pat, Richard, me. It's not. It's really a roles-based thing, which is it's previous chair, current chair, rules coordinate. The chair of the rules committee is usually just the group, and so because Richard is coaching this year, it was myself, Michael Jordan, chair of the rules committee, and then a third member just picked to replace Richard. It happens to be my colleague at Harper, Brett Fulkerson Smith, because he works down the hallway from me. It's very easy to rope him into it.
Okay, so yeah, so at this point we've got a set of questions, and we also get questions from the National Case Writing Committee, and we put those in the mix, and then we talk about, for each case, which would be the best preliminary round question, which should be the best elimination round question. We sometimes do some rewording. So we've all written several at this point. And then we do the random pairing and we see what we have. And if what we have for a particular round is good, then we go with that. But very often it's not good. It'll be something that's, super demanding. One team has to know about CRISPR and one team has to, address a case where somebody's let out a secret about a surprise birthday party and their friend's feelings are hurt. And we just think, boy, this is, not going to put equal demands on the, Cynthia's making a face. I just made that one up. There is no such case. I just, I'll change it. One case is about whether someone can kill their pony because they're angry. And the other one's about CRISPR. I don't know if that helps. Some cases are lighter than others. So when that's the case, then we maybe shuffle the cases around. In addition to the cases sort of being equally demanding, but not on the same topic, we also make sure that the questions are equally demanding. And in the preliminary round, the questions are all sort of roughly the one that you might expect from the case. So that makes it easy. John, did you want to?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say one thing, which is that just a small tweak to what Richard said. I think sometimes what we do, and again, to Cynthia's point about, well, sometimes we'll think a case is this, and then the students see it in a much more complex way. It's sort of the eye of the beholder in terms of the people that are reading these and talking about them as we're writing the questions. And we could have a whole nother conversation about whether it's a good or bad idea to have the question writers be separate from the case writers. I think it kind of is, because you get these fresh sets of eyes and it goes through these different processes. But what sometimes we'll do is if we perceive that in a pairing, case 2 is a little tougher than case 7, but we've got a few different question choices, we might sort of pick the question that we think levels them, right? So then, oh, okay, well, case 2 with these questions is harder, but if we use this question for 7, that's going to make case 7 a little more challenging. And now the cases feel to us to be equal, right? It's sort of like I said, the eye of the three beholders when we do this, but that's the only tweak. But we do try to, like Richard said, keep the qualifying rounds to be a little more straightforward and the elimination rounds to be a little bit of a, not a curveball in the sense of what that, but just a little bit of a, you couldn't guess it hours ahead of time type of question. Sorry, Richard. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then just a little bit to go. So as I was saying, it's sort of easier with the preliminary rounds because they're all essentially, is this proposed action morally permissible or some such. When you get to the elimination rounds, because we're asking students to dig in deeper, it might be something like, if you were the, head of this particular commission, what set of policies would you write, right? Which is a more demanding question than is, X morally permissible. So then it gets a little trickier to ensure that the questions are equally demanding. So there might be more shuffling that occurs at that level. And then, of course, with the emergency round cases, we need to have, a handful of questions available because we don't know where they're going to be slotted in. So the other thing that I always try to keep in mind is there are lots of cases that present themselves that aren't necessarily ethical questions. And sometimes, as we're putting our big list to start with together, one or two will emerge. And we'll look at it and we'll say, is this really more empirical? Are we just arguing about what is the case or what ought to be the case, maybe even in a practical, less moral sense? So there's some effort to make sure that especially when it's one of those later round, if you were the administrator, what policies would you put in place to make sure that there's an ethical component to that. So John, if I've missed anything.
No, that's good. I was just going to talk a little bit about the regional process because it's a slightly different process. But before I say that, I was just going to say what Richard said at the end. There's this sort of element of trust that the case writers are putting in the hands of the question writers, because we could kind of ruin a case with a bad question. Because if we turn an ethically complex case into a simple empirical matter with the question, we've kind of ruined it. And so it really is the processes really require each other to both be thoughtful, right? Because we're both trying to make sure we honor those principles that Rhea had led through, that the questions allow those elements to come out of the cases. This next point is just a procedural one that people might not know about, but often I will hear from coaches that say, like, what's the deal with the questions in this region this year? And here's my short answer. That's not my problem. I'm sort of joking, but the way that works is usually a host or the regional coordinator will write questions, but often they are not writing the questions for their region, because often the regional coordinators and hosts might also be coaches, right? And so that's one problem we always have is, right, if you're on a case writing committee, then you can't coach teams, et cetera. So because that's harder to avoid those conflicts at the regional level, what we do, and Richard started this process, is we basically have question swapping. So Skipper might come up with a set of questions from the Texas region, and then he would send them now through me, but to Andy, who is in the upper Midwest region. And so those become the questions for the upper Midwest, and Andy sends his questions, and those become the questions for the Texas region. So what can be a little bit difficult for teams sometimes in the regions is, like, different regional coordinators have different tendencies. But you never know which region's questions you will be getting that year. So that's what makes it a little bit complex. So that's a process that we might revisit and think about going forward, that type of thing. But just so people know what's happening there, those questions are always being written at the regional level, and then to avoid conflicts, they're sort of filtered through me. That's not required. If you don't have a conflict of interest, sometimes a coordinator will just write the questions and use them. I know that happens in the Northwest every year, I think. Yeah, Richard?
Excuse me. So yeah, I'm inspired by Rhea's list that she read earlier for case writing. Perhaps we could produce some sort of minimal set of guidelines in bullet form for the regional case question writers.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They're similar. That'll say, make sure there's an ethical component, that it's not purely empirical. If it's for a final round, it could be more difficult, and so forth. We can brainstorm.
That's actually a good point. I think the complaint I hear sometimes from coaches is that some regions tend to sort of, there's a clear, like, the theory is embedded in the question. And so that can be part of it. Justin Provo is a former student of mine and had his hand up a while ago, and I yelled at him in the chat to put it down and told him I'd get to him. So now I owe him getting to his question. So go ahead, Justin.
No problem. I appreciate it, John. thank you everyone for letting us enjoy this conversation and get an inside scoop on how these cases are formed. I often find myself saving plenty of news articles, thinking like I need to send this to the case writing committee. And I think one thing I just want to bring up is like if we could somehow disseminate the information on how people can submit case ideas, I think that'll also give you guys some more volume in the future. Because I think previously it might have been someone's email or something like that, but maybe if we could set up a Google form with a link in the description and why someone submits a case, that might actually help you guys get a bigger pool to pull stuff from. With that being said, my question was, how current or recent of an event is like generally qualified for case writing? So I guess the reason I asked this as a competitor and as a coach in recent years, like a lot of the cases are fairly fresh, like within like something that happened very recently. After hearing some more information from this panel, it seems like we try to avoid repeating things, or at least certain maybe questions or specific case elements. So does the time frame in which the ethical event occurred make it more likely to be used? And then to Robert Skipper's point earlier, sometimes an ethical dilemma changes over time with either technology or the way that we approach things. So if you guys could give me some insight into like how does time or the time of the event go into your decision making for case writing?
And now I'm going to get Rhea first, since I put her on hold a couple times earlier. Sorry.
Well, actually, in response to those things, first of all, in terms of submission of cases, thank you. I think that all of the case writing groups love having more ideas to choose from. And one of the things that I think that we may not have been as explicit about, when we submit a case proposal, very similar to how Skipper does it, we do like a sentence long or more summary, just so that we want to outline the moral dilemma. And that's part of the submission process, is tell us what you think the central moral dilemma or theme is, and then give us at least one link. And if you have 2 or 3, that's fine too. But give us the source of the information so that we can verify the facts. And then also what you see to be the question. Now, if there's no moral dilemma, then don't submit it, that sort of a thing. But that's the idea, is that we want the case writer to very clearly be able to say, this is the problem that we want to talk about. And then secondly, hold on, the second part, I'll get back to that. I guess I defer. I think I saw Michael shaking his head, so I don't know if he has anything more to add, but.
I appreciated the suggestion that if you, we should have submissions. It's great to have more ideas, and the more ideas, the easier it is for us to find good ones, honestly. I mean, there's a limit to that, of course. Like if we end up with 1 million ideas, that probably becomes like more difficult to sort through. But yeah, the idea would be to have like a brief summary of what the central point of the case is, and then a link to some kind of news source. Typically, it's super helpful.
Oh, and the currency of the ideas. We don't really care about the time frame that the moral dilemma came up with, that arose. But the one thing we are concerned about is, like, we want these cases to be relatable to the students. So it's often more interesting for them to talk about things that are going on in their world. If we're talking about something that happened in 1960, while it might be an interesting problem, if it's not really likely to directly impact them, it may be less meaningful to them. So we do try to look at something that the kids are going to enjoy talking about and enjoy engaging with.
Great, thank you. So we just have about 5 more minutes. So, oh yeah, go ahead, Skipper.
Yeah, let me say one thing about currency of the cases. We write our cases generally in June, and they don't get actually debated until January or until February. And so there's such a lag that what's current in June may be really old news. So we have to take that into account. And if there's an ongoing, like a Supreme Court issue that will be resolved by the time that the cases get debated, we try to avoid doing that sort of thing. So for that reason, we often will do either purely fictional cases or cases from the distant past, or cases that are timeless. But very often the cases are suggested by current news stories. We just have to work with that issue of the time frame. Cynthia?
Yeah, I just wanted to say sometimes our cases are fictional, right? So the one a few years back about sex bots, for example, one of the favorite cases that my daughter suggested the idea from a video game she was playing. We don't have those, but we suspect we will. I mean, so it's not that every case is a contemporary issue. Sometimes there are issues that are raised in fiction or issues raised in video games, which I'm a huge proponent of. So, yeah.
And one quick note is that we do sometimes communicate out to teams. If we see that this some of the facts might change here between when the cases show up and when the competition occurs. And so an example is this year, the doomsday clock. So Skipper had let me know, look, the panel that decides where the setting is of the doomsday clock will meet between now where the cases are out and when the competition is going to happen. And so we did reach out to all the teams and said, they're going to meet and we will update you if the clock is set at a different time. And it was not set at a different time, but we'll do things like that. Or else we will say, listen, the facts of this case may have changed, but like it is our view that you should then sort of treat it more like a theoretical issue and think through the moral issues as they're stated in the case, you know, that kind of thing. So we try to work with teams to figure out like how changing facts do or do not impact your analysis during the event. You know what, Tyler, thank you for that note in the chat. I think what we're going to do is I put this in the chat a minute ago. In a few weeks after the APPE IEB, we have some committee vacancies on other committees as well. So what we'll do is we'll put out some information. In the meantime, I'll talk with Michael and Skipper about some of the logistics of how we might want to do this process wise. And we will get out some information to people both by email and by the APPE website about process by which you can submit case ideas, how you might be able to join the committee, other committee openings, etc. So, okay. We are almost at noon. Does anyone have a final question before we end?
Sorry.
Tyler, how'd I do? Did I make your job easy?
You made my job very easy.
All right.
Yeah.
I actually
Sure,
do
go
have
ahead.
a quick question. I'm sorry,
Sure.
since we're short on time.
No.
One of the things that I can't remember if I had this issue recently as a coach. I don't when we were researching cases, but sometimes some really good sources come behind paywalls. And I was just curious if there was something that since it's all educational purposes, maybe is there something that we could like store a PDF copy and have it in on the APPE website or something for students to access?
It's actually, we just talked about this year, actually. So, yeah.
You can, if you want to search the paywall, just go to the Wayback Machine and send us a link from that. Sorry, that probably shouldn't give that advice here.
Rhea, what were you going to say?
Oh, I think I actually covered it, and I gave out our emails just in case people, until it's resolved. I gave out some emails for the regional case writing committee, and we often do share information with the national group as well. So we share our list of, I know, chosen cases, and sometimes we give them also the list of cases that didn't make the cut, but you know are still very good moral dilemmas, and so we share around.
Yeah, it's good to know. Justin, why is my brain just shut down there for a second? Oh, the paywall issue. We did talk about this as a IEB council recently, and the reason that we didn't sort of put up a set of PDFs or whatever is just the idea that it should be the case that at any institution, the institution with a little bit of work, you should be able to get access to that. You know, so if you go to your librarian and you say, I can't get behind the Wall Street Journal paywall, your library should be able to get you that information within a few days. So that's what's nice about having the lag time of a few months to prep these, is it shouldn't institutionally be an obstacle, even if at home it is. So.
And a lot
I think too that
sorry, go ahead.
that I don't recall, correct me if I'm wrong, Skipper, you've been doing it longer. I don't think any of the national cases are written with sources based
Right.
on original sources that are not publicly accessible.
Also, since we're at noon, I just wanted to acknowledge that Raquel Diaz-Sprague was able to join us. And I didn't see you right away, Raquel, but Raquel is also a member of the National Case Writing Committee. So thank you to both committees in their entirety, but thank you very much to the members of both committees who were able to join us today. So thanks very much. And thanks to Richard too. And thanks to our moderator, Tyler. And thanks to you all for joining us.
Thank you, John. It's a ton of work. Thank you very much.